Isolation in the workplace environment centers around the concept of segregation, separation, and exclusion. Often, a worker with a disability finds themselves making a decision, disguised as a choice, in order to avoid. Having gained an understanding of the difference between equality and equity, we can now look at the implications of this and contextualize it when looking to support workers with disabilities. One point to note is that it is not an employer's responsibility to fix every little detail for every individual. However, it is their responsibility to ensure that everyone is treated fairly in terms of having the opportunity to be successful and achieve their capabilities. I want you to think about your typical day, and now imagine going through it without your usual level of physical function, sensory awareness, or a non-typical metabolism. So for example, without the use of a limb, without vision or hearing, or with a metabolic difference that requires monitoring and medication such as Crohn's disease. It would make sense to say that it could be more challenging and time-consuming, yet not impossible, providing you had the appropriate amount of time, equipment, and assistance available to enable you. It would also make sense that it is a consideration for every aspect of your day, meaning that you might need to do things differently to what is regarded typical. Having this awareness that every aspect of an individual's day has the potential to be more complex to navigate will instantly make you take notice and search for the inequity of a situation. Think accessibility. Think unnecessary barriers. Always ask the question, is there a different way to achieve the same objective? What would make this easier? And then use the answers to implement a variety of options to ensure that each worker's efforts can be optimized and their capabilities maximized. Many of the best leaders and the best managers already behave this way, but they don't necessarily realize they're doing it. Managers might apply this generally, but due to a lack of exposure to people with disability, they don't make this connection that this leadership applies to all experiences of difference. So in terms of a meeting, that could be, does a participant have to be physically present? Can they join remotely? Can they submit their contributions in writing ahead of time? By providing these options, it doesn't disadvantage anyone, but it does increase the accessibility for those who could otherwise be excluded. This gives a much more holistic approach to inclusion and allows everyone to reach their potential. For decades, the way in which a worker with a disability has been supported to navigate their workplace environment has typically been through adherence to reasonable adjustments policies. This is true in most cases of day-to-day activity and during recruitment. Whilst it was a good first step in creating a more inclusive and diverse workplace and a necessary immediate action to provide some sort of solution, it is certainly not the end point. Why, I hear you ask? Well, it comes back to the concept of fairness. Is it fair that an individual has to disclose additional information in order to access what they need? Is it fair that the required adjustment will be determined reasonable or not by a person or process and set of acceptable circumstances? Is it fair that someone who doesn't have the necessary diagnosis or recognition of their differences cannot benefit from adjustments that could enable them to present their best self? Also, who defines what reasonable even means? What is reasonable request for one individual might be a complete abuse of trust for another. Therefore, does it not make sense to have an environment that is authentically inclusive, removes ambiguity, and enables everyone to maximize their performance? The ultimate goal is to create an environment where any worker, not just those with a disability, has access to an equitable experience and doesn't require any additional authorization in order to do so. We want to remove the unnecessary barriers so the individual has the independence to act in a way that will benefit them through selection of the most appropriate option without the need to differentiate between themselves and their peers. For example, as a manager, you want to be able to state an objective and a deadline, such as a completed report by close of play on the 25th of February. Whether the individual uses voice to text, dictates to a scribe, or types it up themselves is immaterial, assuming they achieve the aforementioned. If there is no requirement that they do this in a specific place at a specific time, then there are no barriers, so creating equity. But if the requirement is that they are at the desk in an open plan workspace to complete any related task, then this could be problematic and they would have to make a request for a reasonable adjustment. When creating policies, ensure you consult a group that represents diversity of need, and you consider alternative routes to the objective by identifying potential barriers. Difference is everywhere within society, and as a result, society is naturally diverse. We need to flip our thinking from viewing differences as inadequacies, weaknesses, and making someone less worthy of an opportunity. It's important to keep a check on our thought processes and privilege, specifically when looking at disability. We need to be aware of ableism. Ableism is a concept based on the idea within society that the perfect person exists, which then equates to normality. Society's ideas of optimal intelligence, physicality, excellence, and productivity, amongst other things, has led to a systemic oppression which we need to be able to monitor so that we can ensure that it is not impacting our actions and decisions when we are interacting with individuals who are not like us. It's important to note that ableism doesn't only affect individuals with disabilities. I'm going to illustrate this using the example of individuals who wear glasses to correct their vision. We're almost blind, pun intended, to those who wear glasses within our workplace or social environments. By blind, I of course mean oblivious, in the sense that we almost dismiss it as irrelevant, hardly a distinguishing feature, and most definitely not a deviation of normal, because it has become socially acceptable to wear glasses, occasionally for fashion, but mostly to correct poor vision. This is a brilliant example of a normalized difference. We weren't born wearing glasses, yet people rarely, if ever, get quizzed on why they are wearing glasses, what their prescription is, or if they wish their life was different. In this example, in fact, this is a brilliant illustration of how positive adaptation, i.e. the invention of glasses, can have a profound impact on enabling individuals in an environment where otherwise they would be at a disadvantage. Now, imagine that glasses had never been invented. How many individuals would be disabled and living a very different life experience than that they have today? This highlights the importance of creating an inclusive environment to adapt and remove unnecessary barriers to support an employer with a disability to succeed. For those whose differences are not yet normalized by society, as in the previous example, they are required to justify their needs, explain their circumstances, and often, and unacceptably, denied opportunities due to the lack of understanding and flexibility of processes, procedures, or even individuals. It is vital that we acknowledge that differences of all kinds are normal, and demonstrate this understanding in everything that we do. When listing the top 5 required skills of an employee for a specific role, none of them will refer to physical ability. Physical capabilities, possibly, but physical abilities, unlikely. Let's firstly distinguish between the two in this context. Capability refers to an individual's capacity to perform, execute, or achieve. Ability refers to an individual's possession of the skills to carry out the role. We need to ensure that we are assessing people based on their capabilities and not on their perceived abilities. Stick with me. Let's take my colleague as an example. He uses a power chair and has no function from the neck down. In determining whether or not he has the capacity to work as part of my team, I needed to look past his ability to execute a task in the way that I would, and assess whether he had the capability to deliver the end goal. He does not typically function optimally until afternoon. He requires someone to act as his hands if setting up equipment, and does not drive or use public transportation. Does this mean that he is not capable of delivering on-site to our clients? Absolutely not. It means that where possible, delivery should occur in the afternoon, and if not, then minimize the need for consecutive early starts. It means that he has a personal assistant to act as his hands and ensure that he can set up equipment as necessary. And it means that he has a driver that transports him and his PA to where he needs to be and when. Most importantly, it means that he is completely capable of achieving the objective of such a work task using his abilities. The key takeaway here is that the focus should always be on the objective. When supporting a worker with a disability, forever keep reference on what it is that needs to be achieved and not the way in which it will be done. To simplify, we always want our focus to be on the what needs to be done and not the how someone will do it or the why they are doing it that way. In order to provide the correct support to enable an individual to exercise their capabilities, reword general questions so they are not specific to disability. Can you do this? Do you need anything from me to enable your success? What specifically do you need to be successful? Using the example of my colleague, as previously mentioned, his answers would likely be, yes. Yes, please. If possible, an afternoon delivery time and a venue that is accessible by car. Ideally, a delivery slot from 1 p.m. onwards and an area for my driver to drop me off. I don't need to know why he's requesting such things, because my primary concern is only whether he can achieve the objective. The detail of how he makes that happen is not of concern to me, because I trust him and appreciate that his abilities differ to mine. Not all people with disabilities are the same or are dealing with the same situation and prognosis. People come to have disabilities differently, and those disabilities themselves operate differently. There are two ways in which people find themselves having a disability, and this needs to be acknowledged in order to appreciate the impact that our words can have on the recipient. The two ways are congenital, where a person has had their disability since birth, and acquired, meaning that the disability has developed or been obtained as the result of something such as an accident or illness. Another point here is to note that disabilities have two states, stable and progressive. A stable impairment is consistent. A progressive impairment is one where the impairment will change or become more severe as time goes on. We must consider the impact of this. A person with a progressive impairment knows that their impairment will change, so they could be waiting for the inevitable. Additionally, they might actually wake up today with less function than they had yesterday. This is important to recognize because it will influence how a person relates to the wider world. For example, somebody such as myself, who has lived with their impairment for their whole lives, or at least as long as they can remember, will have no reference point to what is typical. Therefore, they might well not be able to explain their differences or challenges, as they are likely to have no appreciation for what they are. This is particularly relevant for those who are not neurotypical, because often their difference is internal, not visual, and as a result, significantly more difficult for them to rationalise, in which instance, a question such as, "What do you need?" might not be helpful, as they possibly do not know the answer. A more appropriate question could be, "What are you feeling?" or "What is making this difficult for you?" In contrast, those with acquired disabilities do have a comparison to how life once was, how people spoke to them, how people treated them, what was expected of them, and indeed, what was accepted from them. As a result, they often appreciate the difficulties faced navigating the workplace and wider world, and potentially the injustices that they are now experiencing. This increased awareness could make them more reactive to insensitive or inappropriate comments, because they are dealing with a different set of emotions. They could still be mourning the loss of their former situation, processing the trauma of the experience that got them to this new state, adapting to the new community that they are inevitably now a part of, or dealing with a sense of identity loss as they try to navigate their new circumstances. And there could well be a feeling of resentment of the unfairness that they now experience. This often means that those with congenital disabilities are more accepting of poor treatment, but that doesn't make it any more acceptable. Asking a visually impaired individual, "What can you see?" could be met with the response of, "I don't know, what can you see?" Because if they've always been visually impaired, then they don't know what they can't see. Or this question could equally likely be met with an answer fueled by aggression or sadness, because the individual is instantly reminded of what they have lost. Now, we won't necessarily have this information about a person, but the point is that you need to know that it exists. Always be aware of who you are speaking to and how your words might affect them. When we talk about enabling a worker with a disability, we are referring to making it possible for an individual to achieve their capability. It can be as much about what you are not going to do as what you are. What am I going to do or say to ensure that I'm supporting a worker with a disability to perform efficiently and achieve a successful outcome? Let's start here. I'm not going to assume that my way is the best way, and I'm not going to imply that I know better than the individual I'm trying to support. What I should do is avoid leading questions that influence the recipient's responses or their comfort with freely responding, such as, "You don't require any additional support, do you?" Or, "It's okay that we don't have an interpreter, isn't it?" Avoid words that infer weakness, as this can cause the individual who is the subject to be offended, but equally importantly, can cause the person receiving the information to form an inaccurate opinion and reach the wrong conclusion. For example, rather than saying that an individual suffers with or from a disability, say that that individual lives with a disability. Suffer implies that it is bad or unpleasant. I live with cerebral palsy, and of course there are times where things are more difficult, but I don't suffer because of it. In fact, you could argue that a lot of who I am is as a result of having lived with my disability. We should avoid using limited for a similar reason, as it leads to people making assumptions of what is possible. Both of these words require scope for context to be provided when being used. There are some words or terms that are simply not appropriate or relevant anymore. An example of such is being confined to a wheelchair. This implies restriction to a wheelchair, and there aren't many wheelchair users, a more accurate description, that spend 24/7 in their wheelchairs, sleeping, driving, doing physiotherapy, etc. Though some wheelchair users do drive adapted vehicles whilst in their wheelchairs. Proactive actions to support workers with disabilities are to provide extensive detail of typical processes that include timelines, format, location, and idea of the people involved. This can help with removing any unnecessary anxieties and ensure an individual is best prepared to achieve a successful outcome. Provide information of the typical environment. Descriptions and images of the venues and workspaces prove very helpful here, along with the refreshment and dining area and washroom facilities. This allows individuals to visualize and plan their activity whilst making alternative arrangements if necessary. Provide all communication in a variety of formats, not only what you're producing for circulation, both internally and externally, but also provide the opportunity for inbound communication in a number of formats. For example, if a candidate is showing an expression of interest or applying to your organisation, can they present themselves in more ways than just submitting a written representation of their details, skills, and experience? Providing opportunity for interaction ahead of time, specifically with regards to on-site visits or recruitment activities. By outlining the typical practices of your organisation, it enables all individuals to determine whether or not they need to make any additional considerations. Under a secret organization that has suppressed the existence of We're now ready to bring all of our learnings together to ensure that we are part of a positive process to support workers with disabilities. First things first, we need to familiarise ourselves with our comfort zone and establish where further support or education is necessary. Remember, it's okay to have reservations, uncertainties, and anxieties, but it's not okay to project those onto the worker with a disability. It is not their responsibility to carry that burden for you. In the exercise files, there is an activity to assess your comfort zones so that you can have awareness of the areas and situations that might pose a challenge for you. Be sure to check it out. Once you have an understanding of this, you should then ensure that you are able to recognise inappropriate behaviours. Ask yourself, am I judging or jumping to conclusions? How would I feel if someone treated me that way? And how would I feel if someone treated me that way because of something I can't change? Don't make comparisons. Every person who uses a wheelchair does not have the same abilities or preferences, just as not every person with the same colour eyes as you has the same abilities or preferences. When planning events, assessing employees, devising processes, making choices, implement the strategies of asking, is this or that necessary? Then, why is it like that? And, does it impact the outcome? Whenever you are performing an action or part of an interaction, ask yourself, why am I thinking this? And how is it relevant? Remember, if you can't justify the relevance, then this is not the appropriate time for your action, thought, or words. Finally, ensure that you create an inclusive environment and provide inclusive communications. Remove the need for special requests, additional adjustments, and the requirement for an individual to provide more information than their peers to achieve equitable access. That isn't to say that someone might not want to provide additional information, but it is important to acknowledge that they shouldn't have to, and that it is their choice. Above all, do everything that you can to normalise differences, and this will create a more supportive environment for workers with disabilities. The 13th picture past the original not to feature Jason Voorhees as the killer. Instead, we got a one-off with Roy Burns, a paramedic whose son is killed early in the movie. Though we do get a clear shot of Roy being a citizen upon seeing his son's corpse, the film tries to present numerous red herrings from other witnesses who even Tommy himself. Because of this, Roy never really gets to shine as a character, a problem that would have been alleviated had he been confirmed as the killer right away. Doing so would have added more insight to him. We could even draw parallels between Roy and Pamela Voorhees. Both characters became known because of the death of their children. Number 1, the present-day setting in The Village. M. Night Shyamalan's The Village is considered a turning point for the director's career. While the sixth sense, unbreakable, and Silence were surefire hits, his next effort is where the cracks started to show.